soon see a message recording in progress. And with that, over to you, Sneha.
Thanks, Vibhor. Hi, everyone. I'm Sneha, the first Sneha you're going to hear from this afternoon. So it's evening for us here. I'm based out of Canberra in Australia. And I work with a firm called ThinkPlace. We're a human-centered design organization. And a lot of the work that we do is in the complexity space. Being in Canberra, most of the clients that we work with are government clients. So specifically here, the federal government. So all departments, Department of Health, Department of Agriculture, Social Services, Department of the Environment, and so on. I have with me my colleague who also happens to be another Sneha. I'll just throw it to her for her introductions. And then I can get started.
Hi, I'm Sneha Vaidya. Sneha, I love how even though we moved, we've still found each other, and there's a Sneha with me at ThinkPlace. I'm also a designer at ThinkPlace. I work out at the Melbourne studio. And yeah, I come from an interesting background of qualitative research and then learned a lot of design thinking and HCD, like human-centered design and systems thinking at ThinkPlace. So like really keen to get into a conversation about it today.
Thanks, Sneha. I'm hoping that this is going to be a very informal session. It's not very formal. This is work. What we're doing is we're going to share some of the work that we've done and some of the approaches we take in complex systems thinking. I think there was something else I wanted to share. So the way the way this got even came into place was because I worked with Manish in the past. I'm sure most of you are aware of Manish. I didn't realize that eGov was quite a big organization. I just learned from Vibhor that you've got about 150 people, so that's fantastic. ThinkPlace has about, I think about 130 folks across the world. In Australia, we're about 60 designers. And we've got offices in Kenya, in Singapore, New Zealand, and in the America as well. So I'm happy to get started. The idea is that we'll share some of the theoretical or foundational things around complex systems. And then we'll share some tools that we use typically to deal with complex systems. And then probably open it up for questions. Vibhor, is that a good idea?
Yes, that'd be great. Thanks, Sneha. Okay. So also, like as Sneha goes on, please keep feeding your questions into the chat box, and I'll then relate to her towards the end.
Thanks. Okay, so we'll get started. Vibhor, just let me know if you're able to see.
Yes, Sneha, can see your screen, but we can see the whole screen right now.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that's
well, we can also see here that your Apple ID is asking you to sign into your podcast. But yeah, now we're good.
That's going to keep popping up for some reason. I'm not able to get rid of it. So yeah, please excuse me if that keeps happening.
Sure.
So complex systems 101. It's something that we typically use to share with our clients as well. One of the things that we, the way we work within complex systems is to have that mindset that we're actually in an area of uncertainty. So at the start of really complex projects where you're actually engaging with a really complex system, say, for example, like a sanitary system or waste management, where the systems are all interconnected. I think an important, very important mindset to go into a project like that is to just keep this in the back of mind. This is called the design squiggle. It's design squiggle by Damien Newman. So it's just a way of, what do you say, keeping in the back of your mind that projects can be very uncertain at the start, and you can be in a very difficult scenarios. So working through even just understanding the system itself and working through different stakeholders and the decisions you have to make, it's very likely that you're going to be in this very complex area of the squiggle. And as you do your research, as you do your concepts and use either whatever models that you use, so we use design thinking, we use something called the double diamond. So as we go through the methods and the frameworks, you'll actually reach an area of clarity or focus. So this is just a model to help us designers know that you're in the squiggle sometimes. It's very difficult. It could be very complex. So and not to worry. So if you keep persisting through it, you'll get to clarity eventually. So this is just something to keep in the back of your mind when you're working on projects like this. So the definition of a complex system. So there are a lot of theories behind this, and there are a lot of people who've done obviously their PhDs and a lot of thinking in this, but in very simple terms, just to define a system itself. Sorry.
I'll just request everyone to stay on mute. Thanks. Naveen J, if you can also please mute yourself. Thanks.
What is a system? So the way we define a system itself is the moment you realize that you're actually dealing with a lot of people who have different vested interests. They have their own reasons for being, and they all need to interact with each other. So typically in projects that we come across, we work with the government. The government is providing services to citizens. There are industries and businesses who are impacted. For example, if I just take a social service kind of lens on it, and say you're rolling out some health system or a disability, what do you call it, like a service for disabled people, as an example. So government, multi-levels of government. So you have the federal, the state, the local governments who will be involved. There are citizens and different kinds of citizens who are involved. There will be businesses. So the health sector, for example, people who are providing services who will be involved in the system, and then experts or peak bodies, or and then you've got, so media is, I don't know, it's just like an outlier in this diagram, but you've got universities and researchers and experts who are all part of this system. And the idea is that usually these there are a lot of these relationships, and they're quite dynamic. There's a lot of exchange going on, so interactions and inputs, and there's a lot of value exchange going on in these systems. There are some common rules and background network structures or patterns that you will see. And there is some level of autonomy and constraints on these relationships. So something that somebody does will affect the other, and vice versa. So you'll see that there's partial influence in different parts of the system and partial information in different parts of the system. So just a very conceptual view of a complex system. What kind of problems are complex system problems? They're clear. I'm not going to read out all of this, but as one of the things that really stand out in a complex problem is that there are interdependencies, and they're all causal. And it's often not stable. There are no clear solutions. So solution for one area may work out for it may not work out for a different area. There is no central authority. There's a lot of changing behavior, and those who are trying to solve the problem are also causing it. So it's a lot of back and forth that happens here. I might just let Sneha V know that I'm happy to for you to jump in anytime you feel like. So that's like the definition of complex systems. How do you respond to it? We use a model typically at ThinkPlace called the Kinofin model. I'm not sure if any of you have come across it, but it's if you look up the Kinofin, sometimes I say Kinofin, but I think it's called the Kinofin Framework. It's designed by David Snowden. It's a way to understand different types of systems. So there is something in this quadrant we call as the simple systems. Simple systems are easy to understand. They're easy to make sense of. So your lever, your pulley, cause and effect kind of systems, very few actors. Then there are the complicated systems. They're not very simple, but they are quite predictable. So for example, a Swiss watch, or I think another example would be, I don't know, Sneha, you please feel free to jump in, but system, you know how things will work. So like your phone is a complicated system. It's a system that's being built. You know how it will behave. It's predictable. It's a machine. So it's a complicated system.
Yeah, and just sorry, just to add with complicated systems, it's sort of that it takes some level of expertise to understand, but it doesn't mean that it cannot be understood. And like it works in predictable ways. So you can predict about how these systems will function, and nothing tends to surprise you in terms of complicated system.
Thanks. And then you've got the complex systems. The complex systems are not predictable, but they have patterns hidden in them. And it's made up of a lot of groups of people. So like the previous slide, I showed a lot of actors in there, a lot of actors who have their own agendas. And so there's a lot of push and pull in the systems. The example here in this diagram is not ideal. So a traffic system, yes, you cannot predict accidents, but you can get patterns. But similarly, like a health system, not in the case of the pandemic, but prior to that, like it's still a complex system. Or the the justice system, for example, it is a complex system because there's a lot of people, a lot of parties involved. Then there's the chaotic systems, which we've all experienced in the last 1 or 2 years. The pandemic actually caused the chaotic system. It's unpredictable. It was random. Nobody knew what to expect. It was kind of a crisis. So what you actually had to do there was act, sense, and respond. So the reason why it's important to distinguish these different systems is because, and it helps us understand which system we are working in, and it kind of allows us to choose the appropriate response or a leadership approach so that you can anticipate problems before they arise. So for example, if it's a complicated system, you can make sense of it, you can analyze it, you can act. In a complex system, you actually probe, you understand the system a bit more, so you go into the probing mode, and then you make sense of it, and then you act. And whereas in a chaotic system, you actually have to act first. So if you think about all the decisions that leaders have made during the pandemic, for example, not knowing what would come after the other. So people have made decisions first, then try to make sense of it, and then respond. So even consider, like a fire or a flood emergency, you've got to act first, then sense, and then respond. So this is just a good model to keep in mind. Look it up. There are several similar models, but this is the one that we typically use in our work. Here, I want to share another concept called the complexities tensor, which is essentially, if you think of it, like there are three, if you want to understand a complex system, you look at 3 different dimensions. So to dive into a complex system, you look at the vector of breadth, the vector of depth, and the vector of time. And we'll get into it in a bit more detail. So essentially, like the vector of breadth is how broad the system is, how broad is the ecosystem you're working within, who are all the stakeholders who are involved in the system, and what the contextual drivers are. The vector of depth is about understanding the actual people in the system and their experiences and so the lived experiences of the people. So for example, in the previous example that I was using with the disability sector, so the vector of depth is actually about understanding who are the people with disabilities, what are their life experiences, where do they find barriers in the way they live for it. And then you also look at the people who take care of them, the service providers who are taking care of them, and what their experiences are. So you kind of have to go into the depth of people's lived experiences to make sense of a complex system. And then you can also look at the vector of time, which is how you can't really predict the future, but you can kind of try and make sense of what could be driving things. So it's not about designing the challenges in the complex system for now. It is also about considering what you might design for in the future. So that's the vector of time. So just keep these three things in mind as we take you through some tools and case studies that we have used. I'm just going to pause there potentially to check if there are any questions we might just answer. Vibor, do you know if there are any questions? I'm not able to see.
So there's nothing in the chat. Anyone, if you want to drop in a question quickly on it. So KK sir asks, yeah, what could be the drivers? Sir, can you clarify drivers for what? Please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, this is Krishna Kumar here. The contextual drivers, I understand that they'll be is it the drivers for the behavior, or is the drivers for the context?
So when you mean in the vector of breadth there, the contextual drivers?
I'm seeing it repeating on both sides, right? One is the insight, which is probably around the experience, I thought. But those are not drivers. But the contextual drivers is the situational drivers.
Situational drivers. So for example, there may be, so you could look at the system at play and see what are the things that are I just missed the word I wanted to say, but examples are policies that the government has that could be a contextual driver. There are sometimes political agendas that are contextual drivers for this. There could be a big, what do you call it? Like, for example, a project that we did in the waste space, the changes that were happening in the international system were actually drivers for what was happening in Australia. So you've got to look at the broader context of things. Sneha, any other examples that's coming to your mind?
Oh, no, I was just thinking like it's also about what system you're studying, right? Like there are different drivers when you're looking at like individuals experience through a medical system. You might look at like, budget cuts. You might look at how easily, like where do they live? And that's a contextual driver. Like, are they traveling far or close? So depending on what you're studying, the contextual drivers are sort of anything in their environment that could either be a barrier or I don't want to say trigger, but an enabler to how they experience the system or how their experience in the system is designed or is felt, would be how I'd think about it as well.
Okay. I hope that probably the examples will tell me a little bit more about it. I'll look out for that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay.
Are there any other questions?
I guess not at this point. If they come in, I'll loop you in from the chat.
Okay, perfect. So this is just us breaking down some of what Sneha just mentioned into like what tools do we use to understand then breadth, depth, and time. And this is obviously trying to build a complete picture of people you're designing for, right? Breadth helps you understand the system at a high level. So think about it like a 3D box. Breadth helps you see what it is on top. Depth is actually filling in some of the nuance, details about what people are experiencing. And time is not only always like moving forward or the future, but it's also looking in the past and like historically what things have influenced, what experiences people are feeling currently. And when I say people, users, consumers, what I mean is just who we're designing the system for or who was kept in mind when we designed the system and their experiences, right? Could we move to the next slide?
Yeah.
I just want to flag also that there's no one right way of trying to understand a system. You have to get creative with it. You have to see what system you are in. You might use like think of this as a Swiss knife, right? Like you might use a bunch of things to kind of figure out to move through that squiggle, right? Like to make sense of it. And some things might work, some things might not, because sometimes you cannot do online interviews because people don't have access, or I can't do an interview with a farmer because they don't have time for me. So unless I follow them around in the field, I'm not going to get any information from them. So it depends. Like I can't do a card sorting game with probably a nurse. So it's just depending on where you are, you kind of need to think about what might work best for you to help build this picture again.
I'll just stay on this slide to talk through some of these. So for example, so in the breadth of the mapping of the system, so you've already used tools like this. I think I saw one of your reports, which was really fantastic, by the way. So where you've actually mapped an ecosystem. I think it was the waste, the sanitation project or something. Very fantastic mapping of your ecosystem. So you've got, you know what ecosystem mapping is already about. You want to identify who the key lever holders are in those systems. So there are a lot of users in the system or people who participate in the system, but some of them are very key or important people, so who can actually change the system. So identifying who those key lever holders are. Causal loop diagrams are a way of mapping or making sense of the system. In terms of understanding users, it's important to know who your users are. So even just classifying them as different types or cohorts, we use a model called the 4 voices, which we'll share a little bit about. Of course, qualitative research, quant research, these are things you folks would be aware of. Interviews, whether it is a one-on-one, whether it's through focus groups, different ways of doing understanding your users. And like Sneha mentioned, you might actually just follow them or shadow them around. So it's quite important to be open as designers to choose the method that actually is more effective. Journey mapping and interaction blueprints obviously will come out of all of the understanding of the users. So they become artifacts that you build. With respect to time, Sneha brought up the other one, which is actually looking at the current and the present as well as the past. What I've got here is the futuring kind of tools. So how do you look at how do you make sense of the future? We look at things called we run things like alternate futures workshops, we run cone of uncertainty workshops, or do scenario planning. So these are different ways that and this is not a comprehensive list, like we mentioned. So I let Sneha talk to this one. This is one of the projects that we recently worked on. So I'll Sneha give an introduction of the project and how we use this.
Oh yeah, this is a massive project. This is something that we've been working on for the last 4 months. This is one part of it. So we were brought in by the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment to actually understand what are the options for waste resource management in the commercial and industrial sector and construction and demolition sector. And to know that you can understand that that's a huge, like the scope was massive. And what we did was we broke down the problem into materials, especially for CNI and CND. But what we did is we had a very strong, rigorous stakeholder engagement. So we went to experts and we had interviews with them, and then we did focus groups with, so we did it with policymakers, we did it with producers, we did it with waste managers, and I am forgetting advocates. Yeah, and post that, we ran ideation workshops from all the data that we collected. At the end, we had a lot of data. And to start making sense of it, we started doing a lot of synthesis that went through a few rounds, but this is the causal loop map that we came up with. Now, I understand that this is really hard to follow, but what it really helps is it's actually a thinking tool. It helps the people who are working on the project to actually make sense of the system, to identify where they're having impact, because our key deliverable was trying to develop options for waste resource management. So we could actually, by the end of the project, map where our options sat, and we could see that by actually working towards this option, what spaces in this map could you actually influence and create change. So it was more, maybe we might have to clean it up and make it far more easy to follow if we had to put it up, but as the project went on and we thought through and developed options, it was a really good validation tool almost for us of, are we on the right track? Are we influencing the system at the right point? So it was really helpful. And this was a big part of our synthesis from all the data that we collected.
I might just add to that in the sense, a lot of the circles that we see here, we weren't sure whether, we were leveling it right. These are problems that you might have faced when you're looking at complex systems. So are we putting the challenges and the problems at the right levels? Is it actually part of a bigger problem? Is it a very small problem? So we put everything on the table and then started grouping them. And we realized that a lot of, you can start forming some of these groups. I think we did it over like a couple of weekends or something, where we didn't know, there is no right way to do this, right? So there is no perfect way to do this. So yes, all of these bubbles, they kind of sit, maybe this is all about the market and how the market operates. This is all about how the finance operates. This is how the resource management, essentially like your waste, the streams that get collected and get processed and go to landfill and things like that. These are all the issues we heard about. So we just put everything on a map and tried to group them. And we started drawing lines to say, okay, which one affects which one? Making a change here will affect something there. So just drawing those lines out. And even while doing that, we started realizing that some are negative, reinforcing lines. So something good creates something better. If you make an impact change here, it's going to impact something for the better. But we also realize that there are some that are kind of counterproductive. We call them, I think, suppressing lines, and built those red ones. So essentially to say, if you make a change here, it's negatively going to impact the others. And the idea was that we looked at the circles that actually had more lines coming out of it. And that was a way to actually say that, yes, if you actually did something in this space or this challenge area, it will actually impact the most, impact other areas the most. So that was the way we actually identified like 6 key problem areas and use that as a way to come up with ideas or options for how we might change the system. So yeah, that was a very rewarding project, because we know now, like with all the options that all the suggestions that we made, we know how to prioritize them, because they actually fit within some of those really priority areas, which you can't really see. I think those dark gray circles are the priority areas. So you could actually see that the suggestions that were being made were also within that. So it was a really good tool to prioritize where actions need to be taken. I'll share this link at the end of this. So this is one of the case studies from our Singapore studio. The work that they did was essentially to understand how they might change the experience for migrants who come and work in Singapore, so that I think COVID really hit the migrant workers quite badly, I think late last year. And so the government started this project where with Think Place, where they were asked to map the system to understand how they might actually make some changes to improve the migrant experience or to make some changes. So this is one of the artifacts that have come out of it. So just looking at the different systems and how I think the migrants workers lived experience is right at the center. So just a different way of looking at it. So the workers experience and all the systems that they interact with is as one of the ways to demystify a complex system.
So we have a question, which is, given multiple dimensions around key levers, moving them is likely to have unanticipated impacts. How do we work with those?
We've faced that as well. We look at it as a concept called like, what is the unintended consequence of changing a lever? It is something that you consider in your design. So if you make a change in this space, what are the good consequences, but what might also be the unintended consequences in that space? And then when you kind of have to weigh up what might work or what's better for the system. And if there are going to be unintended consequences, you'll put another say a policy or a regulation or something in place to kind of yeah. So it's actually more important to recognize that it could happen, the unintended consequence, and yeah, recognize that, I guess.
Can I add to that? Yeah, it's also the factor of, actually recognizing those will make your system more resilient, because people do not function in predictable ways, right? So things will constantly change, and then anticipating what will change, and as many of those known unknowns you can think about actually makes your system more resilient. And those are systems that are unlikely to break even in chaos. So they stay as complicated or complex systems, and they don't completely move into that chaos space because they're resilient. So a community that is actually resilient to flood will operate far better and stay in that complex system and not jump into chaos in terms of flood. So that's where a lot of the climate resilience work is as well, is kind of anticipating what those impacts might be.
I'm recalling how COVID actually brought a lot of this to the surface, right? So trying to set some rules in a certain space would actually, people would behave in a certain way, but if it went to the tipping point, it would actually tip the system into chaos. So I think where we saw a lot of riots because people were getting holed up or getting stuck in lockdown for a long time, it would actually tip the system into chaos. But I think over time you kind of start anticipating where that might go wrong. But yeah, I think like what Sneha said, the knowing all of those unknowns or trying to predict some of those unknowns at the start is good for the system, for the project. I'll jump into this one. Sneha, sorry, go for it.
Do you want to go through it? I'm okay. Or okay. So this is one of my favorite models at ThinkPlace, which is the 4 voices of design. This is something that we use really often to ensure that when we're looking at a complex system, have we represented everybody's voice, and B is have we represented everybody's voice equally. So there's the voice of the intent, which is basically your sponsor and who has actual authority in the system. There's voice of experience, so people who use the system and will experience any changes or updates you make to the system. There are voice of expertise, which is a lot of technical, who actually have the expertise. So the technical expertise, probably the academic education, years of experience of working in that system. And then there's the voice of design, who kind of brokers all of these voices, but also brings those tools, frameworks, that help the design of the system, right? So, and you can imagine if one of these are not represented correctly or don't make it to the table, you're not going to have a very well designed product. So if you don't have experience, there is no user experience, you haven't thought of it. If you haven't gotten the voice of expertise, a lot of things like, that you just mentioned, like you might have unanticipated impacts because people haven't thought the problem through or thought about it deeply enough or used expertise. Without the voice of intent usually comes with sponsorship, or with actually implementation or having the the license to implement. And voice of design is whether overall have we thought about the experiential factors of it. So any of these missing, kind of in a way, like how do I say it I have lost my line of thought, but I will throw to Sneha.
Yeah, I guess what we're trying to say is that it's important to consider all voices. So in that, the way you kind of look through a complex system or try to deal with it, one of the things we discussed was depth. So how do you get sufficient depth of user experience and different voices, this is an important model to keep in mind. So to give examples in some of our projects, and I'm going to think of the waste project that we did recently. So the voice of intent was the government who actually got us to start this project. So we finally have to report back to them, but they have an intent. There is a political agenda driving some decisions, but there's also some policies that have to be built out. So they become the voice of intent, and without, like, there has to be that balance from all sides. Voice of experience were the actual people who are using the system. So where is the waste getting generated? Who are actually generating this waste? We had people actually making decisions about designs, or making decisions about where to, what kind of materials to buy before they became waste. So like looking at the whole system, right? So voice of experience there, and voice of expertise being like all these peak bodies and universities and people who've been studying construction or design for a very long time, and they provide that voice. And the voice of design was ThinkPlace and the co-design team that actually brought all these voices together in balance.
I'm just going to jump in because we have a few questions. So a lot of the work when working with systems involves dealing with second order impacts, a lot of which may be unanticipated. Would love to hear your thoughts on experience with designing for resilience versus adaptability.
Could we get a bit more from that from the person who asked? Was it Jojo?
Yeah, it is me. So essentially what we're looking at is, I mean, just to kind of speak a little bit more about resilience and adaptability. Resilience almost assumes that the system responds to change and bounces back to a previous state, right? Whereas a lot of the systems that you're working in now, and especially with things like with climate and sustainability, you realize that maybe reverting back to a previous state is not desirable. What you really need is for the system to be designed in a way that it can adapt to a changed reality, right? So I'm just wondering whether you've come across this and whether consciously you're designed for resilience versus adaptability.
That's a really good point, Jojo. I personally haven't come across a resilience versus adaptability frame within some of the work that we've done. However, I think with what you're asking, some of that futuring, the future thinking or the time tensor is actually a potential way to look at whether the system can be adaptable or whether the system can be resilient. I think that's a really good question, and it's a question that I might take back to some of the experts at ThinkPlace and ask. Sneha, you had something to add. So
yeah, this is just with some of the work that I've been doing with some of my clients, where they're re-looking at what resilience means, right? And that resilience and the definition and the way we think about it should start including adaptability. Can we, how are we designing our systems where they're agile, where they can be changed, where they can adapt to changing situations, because things are changing so fast. This is the problem with a lot of current resilience-based systems, and that's why we can't cope when, like in terms of climate, when we're hit with floods, then drought, then something else. And that's why we aren't resilient to these multiple things, because the system has been created in such a rigid way and has thought about only a few unanticipated impacts, and not created in a way that can be agile and can move faster. So building that in and thinking about how your system can be reiterated to move on is sort of part of some of the resilience, the climate resilience thinking that is happening in Australia right now. So that's sort of where I've sort of seen people work in this space.
Great, thanks a lot. And Sneha Prasad, Sneha, they both, if you'll come across any of these, either research that is going on to this, do channelize it to us. We'd love to kind of have a look at that, either through Vibor or anyone else at eGov, right? I think it'll be great for us to have an understanding of what's going on in this space.
That would be really interesting. Can I ask in what context you're looking to use this kind of framework or information?
I mean, in the platforms that we build, right, and in the type of problems that we are considering, I think it's becoming quite clear that designing a system that looks only at the current, it's not going to be sufficient, right? Because like you qualified, the rate of change is such that it's almost impossible to factor for second order, third order impacts. And hence what you can factor for is the fact that it's going to change, which means that you're not really designing for resilience. You are designing for the system itself to change then, right? And what are those feedback loops that you get that feed back into the system that almost indicates saying that, hey, it's time to change this lever, right? But I've not come across a solid framework on this as yet. This is more just me doing a little bit of research on the side and trying to understand this.
Thanks, Jojo. I think we'll just take that back as well and do some research on our end as well. So thanks for bringing that up. I'm seeing a question from Krishna that says, where do you put government employees, users or designers? They're often the same in government. They're often the same. In government, other stakeholders get missed out, often citizens. Krishna, are you able to just explain the context from where this question's come?
Typically, when anything the government wants to do, be it a new program or whatever, right? And it's rolled out. Let's say, for example, the simple thing like how they responded to pandemic, right? But they decided this is one way to do it, and they did it. Similarly, for any project that the government does, typically it happens that a few of the government employees get together and they try to do it. And most often it is with a very big focus on compliance than with end user benefits being delivered. And that is, and citizens are rarely ever taken into consideration beyond a point. Therefore, when you look at government employees, they are both users as well as the designers of what gets rolled out on the ground. So from that perspective, how do you use anything to sort of segregate that out? Because what gets rolled out most of the time is by them.
Can I start responding to that? So I think this is exactly like, and I'm really happy that this slide is on here right now, but this exactly sounds like when implementation is only voice of intent and voice of expertise. So the government decided they probably want to do something. They've asked a few people who've provided technical advice that is probably in alignment with what they wanted to do. And they haven't really considered voice of experience and voice of design. So I think interjecting with that, and like, of course, there is limited amounts of control you have when you're doing a project, right? But trying to ensure that whatever sort of design suggestions you're making has that voice of experience and has that voice of design, and sort of leveling out the voices so that and it's hard to do, like even we struggle with it, is that when you read your report back to front, or you read what your deliverable back to front, have you in some way ensured that all the voices have received the same treatment, have all the voices been heard the same way, is one way to do it.
Can I add something to that, which I think is it's something that's been playing on my mind, because when we decided to share this experience with you folks, there is a massive difference, right? So a lot of these frameworks were built by first world folks. Yeah. A lot of these frameworks were built for like systems that like in Australia, the population of Australia is the same as the population carried by Indian Railways in a day. The scale is very different. And so sometimes it feels as though like a lot of the models and the frameworks we are talking about, they may be too simplistic for a very, very large, complex system that is India. And from what I've understood here, like I came here in 2014. I think about 2010 or 12, or maybe even 12 or 13 years ago, the Australian government has only started shifting to be open about co-design, the concept of co-design, the concept of human-centered design within government projects only recently, or over the last few years. So I've seen that transition where even the, the work that we do is actually becoming more and more mainstream. So not all projects are going to ask for that voice of experience, or they're not even going to consider it. So your question, Christian, government employees are also citizens, but they're not, when they make those decisions, they're making the decision with the voice of intent. They're not making it with the voice of experience. And trying to even convince your project, whoever is sponsoring it, that you need to spend a good amount of research time at the start to go talk to users, to go talk to people on the ground, people who are getting impacted by some of these decisions, and then bring it back, is actually a thing you have to do at the start of the project before you even pitch it. So when you pitch it itself, you pitch your project with the fact that this is going to take time. We are going to talk to so many people. We are going to conduct interviews or whatever it is, right? And we're going to bring their voice into the conversation, is actually something you do right from the start of a project. It's taken, I believe, like it's taken ThinkPlace also a while to do this with the government here, but now most projects that we do, we actually pitch it in this form. So yeah, I think there's a I'd say that there's a bit of a a journey that you'll or a fight that you'll have to fight to ensure that you capture the voice of experience in your projects, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think we're experiencing some very similar stuff, and so that's why because we often have a problem because we're dealing with them to change it, but they're often the constraint as well. Yeah. Thanks.
We'll probably just run through the next couple. There are just 2 more slides or 3 more slides to go, and then we'll go to the rest of the questions. If it's okay, am I just jump to the next one?
Sure.
This is, sorry.
No, I said that's good. Go for it.
Thanks. This is one other artifact that we use in our work, like quite frequently. So this is one way to show the user's experience or user's journey. So what we're trying to show here is, for example, if there is a user or a person, like a young person who's a pregnant woman in a rural area, is what this example is about. And they need to, and you're trying to design a health system or a health service for them. One of the things you've got to keep in mind is that you want to track the user's journey and their pathway and their interaction points. So they may actually go through in their life, they may access multiple systems. So they may have gone through the education system, where maybe at school they have been educated about pregnancy and things like that, or may not have been educated about it. Then they may they go through an employment system, maybe or maybe not, where there are different types of interactions. And then they, if, for example, in her life, if she falls pregnant and then she has to access the health system, there is different points of interactions. So there's the concept of the larger user journey, which is the like their journey through multiple systems in their lifespan. But then you may also actually, with respect to this particular service or the thing that you're trying to design, which are those really important systems that they interact with, what is their user pathway through that system, and what those interaction points are, and how or where you might actually make some changes so that the experience changes. So yeah, it's a very conceptual thing, but we use it quite a lot, especially when we did a project with the disability sector, and we did another one with homelessness and the justice system. So a lot of juveniles who are homeless end up in jail. So how do we fix that? Was, I think, the larger problem. I'm really simplifying it for the sake of the talk. But when you actually map the system out, you're actually tracking their experience with the health system. They may have had experience of, say, like a bad broken family, they may have been exposed to violence or drugs from the family, and then they actually travel through the, you know, the when do they actually interact with the law and enforcement system, and then how do they land up in the juvenile justice system. So you've got to look at their whole journey, and then look at their interaction points if you want to make a difference in one aspect or the other. So this is, you folks would have probably used something like this. So I just wanted to share that. I think, oh yeah, Sneha, this would be yours.
Yeah, this is just in terms of how you can probably think about like current systems, and then like how do you sort of design for the future as well, where it's either inventing or transforming systems. And I think that also comes in with actually, you know, there's like adaptability where you're improving as you go, but there's also like transformation where you've changed the system completely. So a lot of the unanticipated impacts, a lot of the barriers in the system are completely sort of designed out of it. So that's sort of where transformation is. The way we kind of work through this at ThinkPlace is do a lot of scenario building. So we think about as many trends, as many futuring scenarios as we can, and look at it from different angles of the social, economic, political, financial, and we sort of build that future scenario and take our clients to that future scenario and sort of create design challenges within that, so that, you know, we start building value models that do not exist currently, but sort of, and then link them back to what kind of needs to improve or evolve today to meet that sort of transform future. So we use this for the waste project that we mentioned earlier as well, where we actually looked at how international markets are evolving, how technology is evolving, how climate change action is evolving, how waste collection, sorting, technology in that space is evolving. And we sort of created that futuristic scenario and then had people do design challenges within that and the workshop. And it was really successful in terms of what ideas or intervention points people came up with as to that needed to be tracked back to the present state.
This is another tool that we've used called the cone of uncertainty, because you're trying to design or plan a roadmap, for example, for the system that you've designed. So you're trying to come up with a bunch of activities or actions that you might actually take in this space. So in a workshop where I think we had about 30 or 40 participants, all representing different states and governments. They had all come, and we also had, I think this was for disaster resilience planning or something like that. That was the context of this project. And we had industry players like insurance groups and banks and Red Cross and a few other emergency services folks who were all in the room. And what we did was we did this thing called the cone of uncertainty. So essentially how it works is this model. This is where we are at the moment at the left. This line that you see, the straight horizontal line, is time. And we drew multiple, what do you call it, like different time scenarios to say immediately in the next 1 to 3 years, maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, and in the future up to 20 years. We drew, we boxed that. And then we said, okay, here are some, we gave people an option to go away and come back, like to write up things that they wanted to do or change in the system. But either they were activities that they were already doing or things that they wanted to do in the future. But the idea was that you would come and stick it up at a location where either in the time slot, which is your 0 to 5 or 5 to 10 or 10 to 20 years. And the more, like these are experts, right? People on the field who understand how things work. So they are in a better position to actually say whether the change can actually be certain or they're quite uncertain. So if they knew something was quite certain, they would put it closer to the line. and anything that was uncertain was going to be stuck away from the line, if you like. So, the further it went from the straight line, it was an uncertain activity, and something that was more certain, they were sure that something like that could be implemented. We actually stuck it closer to the line. And then we went away and synthesized it and came up with, like a potential roadmap for what might actually change, and how you might actually, where you might actually start interventions straight away, or where, this kind of also helped in building a further causal loop map, if I'm not wrong. So this was another project like that. I'm just looking at the time. I think that those were all the slides we had, actually. I'm going to stop sharing and
and there's also Amay's question, which is where and how do we factor in constraints? Understanding a system is not the same as having the leverage to influence it, right?
Amaya, do you want to just talk to that question, give us a bit more context? Is Amaya still there? Understanding a system is not the same as having the leverage to influence it. That is absolutely correct. So I guess, like, one of the ways to look at it, I was talking about it, was the causal map sometimes helps you to find leverage points to see which kind of areas impact or have more connections. So if you actually used that as a leverage point, you could actually influence it. So one tool is that. The other tool is, like, when we do stakeholder mapping, we also try to kind of identify, out of all the stakeholders, who are the key lever holders. So that's also another way to kind of influence it. So I hope that answers her question. Just checking, Vibor, is there anything else?
I mean, I cannot speak for Amaya, but I think given low capacity, like, let's say the voice of authority dominates the system, and you're working in case where even a well-reasoned explanation might not sit well, and the approaches are either multi-valued or illogical. In that case, also when the system itself has constraints, as in the capacity of people, the kind of information that is available, or the kind of money that can be put into the system. In all those cases, while you might understand the system, going about influencing it has more operating constraints. And in that case, how do you see sequencing efforts towards building a high capacity system? So starting wherever you are, and what would be the first next step or the first change that should follow towards going into a direction where change is more like there's more receptibility to change?
That's a really tough question. So, you kind of design all of these things, and then you want to see it in implementation, obviously. So that's always it's always been a big challenge area for us as well. While I think there are some straightforward answers, like, oh, let's take the low-hanging fruits, let's try changing that, and all of that. It's always a fight to kind of change the really key important things. One thing that's coming to mind is I met with, I think, one of the leading designers in India, and one of the things he said, so he's designed a lot of these kind of things where he's understood the systems really well, he's mapped things really well, and then what's the next thing? How do you actually make sure implementation happens? Is one of his answer was that sorry, just a bit of disturbance. When you actually write up a business case, or you actually explain to whatever report it is that you write up, you've got to make a really strong business case for it, and you want to give an enough Okay, bye. 2 minutes. You want to make sure there is enough detail in there so that whoever you hand this over to is actually able to continue building upon it. So there is, I don't know about you guys, but sometimes like we stay on the design side. When it comes to implementation, it gets handed over to somebody else. So you kind of face that problem as well. So the best thing you could do as a designer, we do as designers, is to make sure there's enough artifacts, there's enough evidence base, enough user stories in there to keep that thing going, if you like. And then you have to turn the people you're working with into champions as well. So we spend a lot of time actually educating our clients about why this is important, and they actually become part of the cause. So they are the ones who keep championing it. I guess that was my response. Anything else, Sneha?
No, I think you responded like quite well to this, because it is tricky, right? Like when we work, and especially when we work with government, there are other agendas that we need to be mindful of when we're sort of even producing work. And how do you balance that, and how do you still put forward the recommendations that you have heard from the users and the research that you've done is something that we do struggle with. And I think over time, we've found different ways and tools of ensuring that all of the research that we've done is captured, or at least covered, so that the implementation team will pick it up. And I think one thing that we did recently was like build these things called empathy tools. So really strong, like a whole section in a document like that had user stories in a very deep way. That even though like some of the recommendations weren't taken up by the client, but we'd still captured those user stories, barriers, and things like that. So whoever came across that document would at least see that and know what the user experience was. So
I guess that's it from us. I'd really like to get feedback from all the participants, whoever was there, to just get a sense of whether this was useful, whether this resonated with you folks, whether there's something more you want to learn from us, or any kind of feedback will be great. And I'm also keen to hear about your stories or the challenges that you've all been facing. So I don't know, this is probably not, right now is not the forum, but hopefully, we'd hear a bit more and stay in touch.
Let's definitely do that, Sneha. I think as we are also, as kind of Manish kind of started that thought, and I guess a lot of us are interested in looking at complexity systems and how do we take up our own approach of platform thinking into engaging with and hopefully solving wicked problems. And I guess this means in substantial terms is that we'll be stealing some more of your time as we go ahead. So hopefully as we'll stay in touch, and I guess I would like to thank you both for your time and for fielding all the questions and taking us through your own approach. One more thing, I want to end the session with a particular book and a particular quote from that. So I think I got my foray into systems thinking from the Donella Meadows book. And it starts with a really beautiful quote, and that's something I want everyone to leave with today. It's that it's picked up from another book by Robert Persick called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So everyone, I'll read it out for you. Once you're done, please join us on Slack on Systems Thinking at eGov, because we're just building this thread and we are building this conversation and this muscle within the organization. And I guess all of the further readings and the conversations, you'll get more information there. So here's how it goes. If a factory is torn down, but the rationality which produced it is left standing, the rationality will simply produce another factory. If a revolution destroys a government, but systematic patterns of thought that produce that government are left intact, then those patterns will repeat themselves. There's so much talk about the system and so little understanding. And that's the mystery we are going to try and unravel as we go ahead on our journey on systems thinking at eGov. Thanks a lot to Sneha and Sneha for giving their time to us today. Thanks, everyone.
thanks, guys.
Hey,
Thanks
thank
to
you.
both.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everyone.
Sneha. Both of you, thank you for fielding the questions and and taking us through this interesting journey.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Krishna.
was great. Thanks, guys.
I see. Yeah, everyone's almost left. Thanks a lot, guys, folks, once again. Um, yeah, so I'll personally be in touch because this is the kind of stuff that fascinates me. So whether or not there are a lot of volunteers in the organization, you'll at least have one hand standing all the time, because I am looking to like move from a systems map to a systems model at some point of time now. And personally, also this is an area of interest. How do you wed the design thinking and the systems thinking together in order to hopefully do stuff? And we are in the middle of a lot of complexity. So really loving it. Looking forward to further conversations. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Vibhu. Thanks for organizing it. And I think it took us a while to actually get to this